Welcome to everyone who's joining us. We've got a minute or two before the official start. So what I thought I'd do is, before we get going, I've got a polling question for you to get you the juices flowing, to get you thinking. So just while we've got other people joining in, we'll put a polling question for you about how do we navigate the potential for a deep recession, which more and more people think we're heading towards. Just while we're having people join the session, please feel free to take the polling question. And you can answer, you can choose as many of these options as you want.
Wow.
And yeah, for the people taking the polling question, you can choose as many of the options as you want. Sorry, that last one should say, do nothing, let the market take care of itself. I've missed the final two words on that. Very good. You okay there, Bruce?
Yeah, I have mine. There we are.
Sounds like you're
I have to tap my iPad.
Oh, I see. Right. I thought you were rebuilding your PC while we spoke. All right.
Yeah.
Just before we start, then let's get going and let's share the poll that the results that we've got so far. It's interesting. So we're pretty much neck and neck between investment in retraining people to work in new industries and support for people starting their own businesses. Early on, guaranteed basic income was a winner, but it slipped back into third place, jointly with investment in the Green New Deal. And then we have investment in new science and technology-led sectors, not getting as much support as some of the others. Supporting at-risk sectors, only 30%. So we should put more support into hospitality, leisure, aviation. Interesting. Just before this started, we saw that American Airlines are laying off 30% of their management and support staff. And then relatively low support, just 20% of you think that we should be raising taxes on the wealthy to pay for all this, or for corporations. And only 20% of you think that we should let the market take care of itself. So quite an interesting spread. Normally in this, we tend to have more of the progressive policies being supported because it tends to be the people who come along, but that's quite an interesting start to the conversation. So without further ado, let's press on with the session. Thank you all for joining us. We have 4 of the incredible contributors from the book today: Professor Bruce Lloyd, Miranda Mantey, and Jerry Edling. And they're going to share with us some of the ideas from the book. Clearly not all of them, otherwise there'd be no point in buying it. But I'm going to pass around just for each of them to take 15 seconds, no more, to just introduce themselves and explain who they are and what they do. So let's go around clockwise on my screen. Let's start with you, Miranda.
Yeah, hi, I'm Miranda Mantey. I am based out of Alberta, Canada. I'm a strategy and foresight analyst at a regional bank called ATB Financial, and I'm also currently doing my master's in foresight at the University of Houston.
Okay. Can I ask the panelists to mute your mics when you're not speaking, because we're picking up a bit of background from somewhere, I'm not sure. Okay, Bruce, your turn. Why don't you introduce yourself as we go around my screen?
Hi, you'll have to indicate if you're expecting me to speak and you don't hear anything, you'll have to tell me.
I'll unmute you, Bruce, don't worry.
Okay. You can do that as well, can you?
I can, I have the power.
Oh, right, well, I'll leave it to you. I'm an emeritus professor of strategic management at London South Bank University, and have been involved in future studies and strategy issues since the 60s.
Excellent. Thank you, Bruce. And Jerry.
Yeah, I'm Jerry Edling. I'm a an editor and a writer at KNX, which is the only all-news radio station in Los Angeles. I've also been a keynote speaker. I've spoken to the World Future Society, the National Space Society, and the Berlin International Freedom of Expression Forum. So.
Thank you. Okay, so the way the session is going to work today is that each of the speakers is going to take sort of 8 to 10 minutes to give us some of the ideas in their chapter. Then we'll do a polling question around those ideas, and then we'll open up to discussion with the other panel members on that topic and take the Q&A from the audience as well. What I would really encourage you to do is, if you have a question for the panel, please post that in the Q&A section, and you can make sure that you'll see all the questions there. You can vote on the ones that you think are most interesting, and we'll take the questions that have the most votes, so that we kind of go for the things that are most interesting to the most number of people in the audience. Okay, so let's start with Bruce. Bruce, why don't you kick us off with some sharing of the thoughts around your chapter? You talked about a progressive New Deal. Tell us more about what that means. And I'll unmute you. You should be unmuted, Bruce. I think you're pressing unmute at the same time.
To press yeah. Okay.
You're good. You're good.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you and your colleagues for all the incredible work you put in putting the book together and all these presentations. It's quite amazing in such a short period of time. The theme of my talk is, first of all, don't waste a good crisis. Plenty of people have said that. And even I think the Chinese say that the other side of a crisis is the word opportunity. So in the middle of this horrendous COVID-19 experience, there's an urgent need to recognize that it is an opportunity to take new initiatives or accelerate existing ones that can help us move in a more sustainable new normal direction. To start with, of course, we need clear objectives, namely to produce that more sustainable society. And the role of strategy is to try to put together a wide range of initiatives that end up hopefully reinforcing each other and generally help us move in the right direction. As in almost all areas of strategy, there are no perfect answers and you can't do everything. And so priorities matter and are inevitable. My chapter contains a number of suggestions. Most are not new, and many are covered by the other authors in their contributions to the book. Many are already happening, but we need more of them and we need faster implementation. Together, they should help us move in a much more sustainable direction. And although mainly focused on the UK, the basic approach, I believe, is relevant globally. In essence, I believe there is a need to combine a new Marshall Plan that looks at trying to sort out all the financial issues, and there are plenty of those, with a new beverage plan, which is particularly a UK concept that emphasizes a positive, social focused agenda. The beverage plan was something that they came up with during the Second World War that led to the development of the welfare state. And this more socially focused agenda should start with giving much more recognition to the value of the health service and other essential workers, as well as much greater concern for the disadvantaged in society. And that would involve increasing investment in the health and environmental sectors, particularly in investment in trying to cope with climate change issues. And we probably will have to combine that, or should combine that, with less investment in military indulgences. It's amazing how much one of these new fighter planes costs, hundreds of billions of pounds. And also in what we in the UK have been a bit preoccupied with is high-speed trains, where there should be a greater emphasis on the quality of the travel experience rather than the speed itself. And we need to move away from this obsession that we've got with GDP as a measure of societal success. We've got to recognize that GDP is a quantity measure, and what we want are quality measures, and those are much more relevantly combined into social progress indicators. We ought to have a greater emphasis on relationships, values, wisdom, and social enterprise, rather than the rather materialistic preoccupations that we have that focus on short-term profits and the accumulation of things. And we need to be much more concerned with long-term purposes and much more emphasis on responsible, compassionate capitalism. In this context, there's an even greater need for transparency and further squeezing of tax havens, if not their abolition. We need to have less emphasis on arrogant, opinionated, egotistical, authoritarian leadership styles, and in its place, a more collaborative approach that recognizes purpose and evidence is more important than personalities, prejudices, and short-term politics. Such a move, compared with all the other items and many others, should help us improve trust levels in society, which is badly needed. Governments need to try to move beyond day-to-day politics in order to focus not only on dealing with the immediate crisis and how we phase out lockdown, but to move to a new, better normal, which would involve a significant shift in our economic and social priorities in a more sustainable direction. It would be unrealistic to expect to get 100% agreement on the details across the various people involved on such a program. But if we reached an 80% relatively quickly, that would be more than sufficient to be able to get on with things and to make progress in the immediate future. One critical point here is that we desperately need to see a significant improvement in the quality of the conversations that take place over these initiatives. And again, to try to avoid personalities and prejudices and short-term politics. In some ways, the crisis appears to be fostering a new level of global cooperation between experts and professionals, although that doesn't seem to be necessarily the case between politicians. And I have to say that the situation in the US is both particularly horrific and in many ways extremely worrying. In addition, this new technology will accelerate both general learning as well as many other activities, including those focused on researching global social and health-related issues. Overall, there are plenty of other areas where the development of detailed initiatives and policies can be integrated into a coherent strategy, as well as evolving some detailed priorities for action. Again, as I mentioned earlier, although these suggestions are primarily focused on the UK, many, if not all of them, are generally applicable worldwide. And such an approach, I think, would help reassure us that we're not wasting this crisis, and so help us move into a better, fairer, and more sustainable society and world for future generations. And the chapter ends with a couple of questions. What should be included in this package of initiatives? And how can we make them happen as quickly as possible? Unfortunately, I don't believe that time is on our side.
Thank you, Rick. So let's take the audience's views on that straight away. Let's do the poll, and then let's see what the response is to your polling question. So let's put a polling question up on screen based on the topics that Bruce just outlined. While we're doing that, Bruce, of all the things you talked about, which would you say are the sort of two issues that would garner most public support today? Of all of the measures that you talked about, which do you think would be the easiest?
I think the easiest one,
given where we are.
Okay.
Yeah.
The easiest one is, of course, to give a boost and a higher priority to health and the other essential care and essential workers, and more investment in the health sector. I think that there's plenty of emphasis on trying to make progress in the climate change area as well. And maybe we've got to deal with the homeless and housing and the disadvantaged as well. And I think, generally speaking, that agenda would have quite a bit of support.
Okay, let's bring the other panel members in for your reflections. Let's start with you, Jerry. What are your reflections on the Bruce's idea for a new Marshall Plan? For those that don't know, obviously the Marshall Plan was the US investment of significant amounts of money into Europe post-World War II to enable the rebuilding of Europe. And then the Beveridge Plan, as Bruce said, was a plan created by, was it Lord Beveridge in the 1940s, just before the end of World War II, which became the basis for the UK welfare state after the end of the war. So what's your view, Jerry? I mean, are we ready now? Do we need this kind of grand planning moment to rebalance the world and individual nations?
I think we do. I think it's an excellent idea, because the Marshall Plan sort of galvanized the alliances that took place after World War II, and it sort of created the framework for the almost Western-dominated framework for the world. And I wonder whether the current framework, which stemmed from that, is going to survive. We've had fractious politics in it, and disputes within NATO, allegations that the U.S. leadership and Russian leadership are even closer than some of the NATO allies because of some of the political static that's been going on. And so I guess I'd frame it in the form of a question to Bruce. Do you think the current alliances will survive, or will a new Marshall Plan sort of be a reset for all those alliances, and do we need a reboot of the world system?
First of all, I'm pretty sure that we're not going to get the Marshall Plan essentially coming from the States at the moment. And in a way, the European community is trying to do something like that among its members. Depending how bad the crisis gets, the European community and other developed worlds might need to find ways, and the international agencies as well, of providing a great deal more support for the countries that are finding it much more difficult to deal with it because they haven't got such developed health services. They've got much more overpopulated communities, so it spreads much faster. And there is an opportunity there, but I'm not sure that I can pick out many leaders. I doubt if we're going to find that the very compassionate and imaginative leadership that we seem to be getting from interesting a number of women leaders like Ahern in New Zealand and the leader in Iceland. Some of these small countries that have dealt with the issue have got a bit more moral authority to try to get other people to work together, but it's going to be pretty difficult.
Thank you, Bruce. Miranda, what's your take on the issues Bruce raised? Because in a sense, Bruce's is almost a mirror to your chapter, where your chapter talks about, you know, a lot of the potential fault lines and things that could go wrong. Bruce has talked about, you know, what are the things we need to invest in order to put us on a more progressive path. What's your take on what Bruce has talked to us about?
Yeah, I definitely think it's obviously hard to predict anything in a time of crisis. And going out, there's definitely the two routes of a more globalized world or a more isolationist world. What Bruce has said that's really sticking out to me, and Jerry touched on a bit as well, is the new international relationships that might be formed and have been forming. And if we look at, you know, China and what they've been doing with the Belt and Road Initiative, they've for years been investing in developing nations. Likely not very altruistic investment. It's more I've heard the phrase debt trap diplomacy of we give you loans and then when you default on them, we have control over you. So I think we're already seeing those relationships being built, and they're not talked about as much as potentially they should be in regards to kind of China's moves. And so I think with this time of crisis, people are going to start really looking and evaluating their relationships with other countries and with world organizations to see how we can continue to progress better. How that'll pan out, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, raises a question for me, Bruce, which is we often talk about countries funding this and countries coming together. Is this a moment where we need to look to the corporate world, who are sitting on potentially trillions of dollars of wealth across them? Is this now a time to kind of imagine new partnerships and relationships between companies and countries without it becoming company takeover? You know, is there a time now to start thinking about different kinds of relationships to help particularly the most weak and failing nations get over the abyss?
I can only say that in recent weeks, the amount of advertising that's been done by companies that has really reflected a sort of compassionate capitalism that we haven't really seen before, and we can build on that. And some of that is making an international contribution. Some of the global companies, I know that Unilever and I think even people like Coca-Cola and some of those companies that seem to have the resources. Of course, there's a lot of quite major companies that don't have resources at the moment, and they're going to rely on probably government support to keep them on their feet. So I think there's a little bit of an opportunity for that. Hopefully we can build on the bits that are there to make them more relevant and effective.
Okay, thank you. Let's share with you the polling results then. So it looks like tackling COVID seems to be everyone's top priority. Any surprises in there in terms of the responses? Improving our ability to have constructive conversations with each other comes out second, along with reducing GDP as a measure of progress.
One of the points that I would make about this is that most of them can be done together as a strategy. They're not alternatives. If you do one, it will probably help in sorting out the others. So it's very interesting that, and it doesn't surprise me, the one that gets a low vote, but it is very particularly interesting that in having more constructive conversations and greater control over narcissistic leaders.
It's interesting that one came out second lowest, given how much obsession we have with the narcissistic people at the top of certain nations, that actually this group isn't that bothered about them. Interesting as a route forward. Okay, let's
okay.
that the sharing of that poll. in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. But thank you very much, Bruce. You've got us going with an excellent set of thoughts to get the juices flowing. Now let's move on to Miranda to share your thoughts from your chapter and tell us a little bit about what you have to say.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me today. It's been an honor to be involved in these and be included in the chapter, especially with such great thinkers on this call. So my chapter is called World War Contagion, Strategies in the Fight Against Our Common Enemy. And what it was rooted in is when you dig into the economic and political and social conversations that we're having right now, the more and more you can see the resemblance to warlike situations. The difference is, instead of, there's a common enemy that we're fighting, an enemy state, the difference is we're actually fighting a common enemy, and every country has the same one, and it's inside of our countries instead of external. And it can come in the form of, an innocent tourist as opposed to somebody with a little bit more threatening. And so there were three areas I dove into. The first was looking at surveillance, which has been a very hot topic recently. The emergency acts that countries are enacting have given the governments a lot of permission and a lot of liberty. And the question becomes, when should this permission actually end? A lot of the time after situations of war, it doesn't end when it should. It goes on far too long. And Edward Snowden has warned the US citizens that he sees that the government could be abusing power post when they need to. And there's three areas in this surveillance side. One is the medical demand. So the biggest thing is the contact tracing apps. I always say that wrong. And it has proven to be effective. These apps have shown that even if just 60% of the population uses them, they will be reducing infection rates. And so that's quite a powerful thing. A lot of the demand and interest from the consumer side I see is being rooted in instability and fear. I see fear as a major driver for people willing to give up their rights and to be surveyed, and it has been a driver in the past. This is another situation where that's the case. And on the flip side of that, though, we also need to be protecting our consumers on this. And so there's two types of apps that are in market right now. One is the Decentralized Apps, and these are the ones owned by the government. Although the data, I believe, is anonymized and encrypted, the government still has full access to each data point. And the benefit of that is that the governments can then see transmission rates and infection rates quite well. However, it does lose the privacy aspect of things, and people that might be distrusting the government are less likely to use them. The flip side are the decentralized apps, and these are the ones used by or are being developed right now by tech companies. They're using emerging technologies, specifically, I believe, blockchain, and so their goal is to protect privacy. However, when you really get down to it, at some point down the line, somebody still has access to this data and to your information. On the decentralized side, it's a lot harder to get, but tech companies still have that key. And so who are the groups that we actually want to give this power to? Do we want it to be the government? Do we want it to be the tech companies? And that's something that we need to continue to acknowledge and discuss. I do see this as a great sign, though, that both governments and tech companies are prioritizing consumer privacy and protection. And I think that this will continue on in the future from this pandemic. There will be, in my opinion, likely kind of data crises where companies have ended up abusing people's rights, and it really was just a marketing facade. But I also think that there will be companies moving to use these technologies to actually follow through on the protection. There's the technological side, blockchain, federated learning, and there's also the data governance side of data trusts. And so those are some emerging ways that I think companies will start to embrace. As well, the second bucket I dove into has been the supply chain challenges. Since the beginning of 2020, 24 nations have taken steps to ban or limit the export of medical supplies or equipment. And that's created extreme tensions between different countries that used to play quite nicely with each other. Beyond that, there's also the logistical pressure in general for non-essential goods as well. So an example is 1/3 of Canada's trade with US and Mexico is transported by air, and half of that goes in the belly of a passenger plane. So even for non-essential goods, we're having issues getting them out to other countries and receiving them as well. And so I think that this will push us to a more protectionist mentality, and has started to as well. After the 2009 recession, the average global supply chain was shortened by 50 kilometers per year between 2012 and 2015. So historically, as countries face instability and uncertainty and economic struggles, a move is to support in this supply chain. And studies have shown that economic downturn does end up being more protectionist mentalities. I think this could also go as far as to see potential localization. There was a premier in Canada that said he wasn't going to rely on President Trump or any prime minister or any president or any other country ever again for medical equipment. And so for certain areas that maybe have been let down by their national government, there might be moves to localize these supply chains as well. Canada has also signed a long-term agreement with a medical supplier for N95 masks. This supplier has never actually previously made these masks. And so this contract requires them to actually build the facility in Canada. And so that's not a short-term move by any means by the government. And so in the future, I believe that, we've previously had this globalized low inventory, just-in-time delivery. I think for a certain set of goods, it'll be proximity, guarantee of service, and access for products. The two kind of follow through ideas in this space as well with the more protectionist, isolationist mentality is I think this will increase added pressure on international global bodies like the WHO, who I currently see as being a large scapegoat in this crisis. There will probably be pressure for it to be restructured and reevaluated. I think secondly, it also could push down to consumers. There's extensive push, I think, in most areas of the world for buy local and even less tangible data. My personal experience and mentality since this has started is to use more Canadian goods and products. As far as, my food delivery platform, I'll try to pick the Canadian version as opposed to the American when possible. And so I think that could continue beyond the crisis as well. And then the last key, bucket of the warlike comparison is the frontline workers. And so there's two different groups here. There's firstly, the medical group. I think the world's done an excellent job so far at supporting and celebrating these workers. And in the long run, I think there could be more long-term initiatives similar to what we've seen with veterans. So potentially tax benefits or, being celebrated in parades and things like that. On the flip side, though, we've also seen major mental health considerations in regards to veterans. And as these workers are, going and risking their lives every day, just waiting for symptoms to appear in themselves, they're also, just like all of us, seeing their friends and family face risk. And on top of all of that, seeing their coworkers and their friends in the hospital getting sick as well. And so there could be some serious mental health considerations for these workers going forward. The second group are, the grocery store clerks and the gas station attendees and the food delivery drivers. And the quote of "it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight" really stuck out to me in regards to this group of people. The more wealthy can stay at home and have somebody go make their burger and deliver it to their door, and those that face more financial pressure have an obligation, to make ends meet by going to work. And so I think as we see, we're already starting to see this, but as the crisis continues to evolve and wrap up, we're going to see increased numbers of death and illness in minority communities and low-income communities. And so there could be increased both racial and class pressures as we come out of this as well. That will be a difficult topic to dive into. So that's kind of high-level overview of my chapter. And I'd love to hear feedback on it. If anybody on the call reads it and adds me on LinkedIn, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So I think you're muted, Rohit.
So thank you, Miranda. Yeah, the book is available tomorrow in all good bookstores and Amazon. And ours, of course. Let's take Miranda's question while we start a conversation around that. Okay, so while you're voting on the likely outcomes, or the most likely outcomes in our post-pandemic future, let's get some reactions. Let's start with you, Bruce, and let me unmute you so you can talk. What's your reaction to what Miranda said?
There's a lot of very interesting and useful points. The one thing that is a particular issue in the UK is this contact tracing. And that's, I think, been a bit of a problem because various people think we should be inventing our own system. We don't seem to have been able to learn from the experience of other parts of the world fast enough. And I think that's going to be one of those areas where you could see a great deal more international cooperation, because everybody's got something to benefit from that. There's no real competitive advantage that should be given to people who manage to do this successfully, although there's some bits of technology that would be very helpful, and they should be as widely available as possible. But we seem to have had quite a problem sorting that out in the UK.
Miranda, do you want to come back on that at all?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, and the contact tracing apps that I think have, from what I understand, have done the best have been ones based out of Asia. And I think the challenge with applying the Asian models to the Western world is the response to data privacy is quite a bit different in the Western world. Asian communities tend to be a lot more open to consuming and sharing data. On top of that, they haven't necessarily done a great job at keeping people's privacy. So an example of that is South Korea actually went as far as to publish the travel routes of people that ended up being COVID positive. And they were so detailed that other citizens were able to essentially reverse it and figure out who these people were. And they were getting publicly shamed. And there's articles I've read that people that were discovered were pleading with the government to prioritize anonymization better. And so, which was quite heartbreaking actually. I think it'll be, yes, I think there's definitely learnings we can leverage, including that from other models throughout the world. But I think the issue is nobody's gotten it right yet. And so how can we leverage the best part of each model to try to prioritize, the efficiency in determining where COVID has been and who might have it, mixed with keeping people's privacy. So it's a big challenge, I think.
Right. Jerry, let's unmute you and let you have your thoughts on what Miranda had to say.
One of the things that that stuck out to me was when you were talking about inequality and the effect on that. I read a very interesting study not too long ago about the spread of the coronavirus in New York. And everybody, I guess the common perception is that, and of course it's true, Manhattan is very crowded and you have crowded subways and very few people use cars. It's more public transportation. So you have this sort of natural congregation of people that could naturally spread the virus. And that's true. And there's no question that public transit and the fact that it's a crowded, walkable city has an effect on this. But somebody crunched the numbers and found out that the spread of the virus was actually more intense in the outer boroughs, in Queens, the Bronx, Brooklyn, than in Manhattan. And the outer boroughs are more spread out. They're more like suburban. It's more single family homes and traditional apartment complexes as opposed to row houses and very crowded living conditions. The density is much less in the outer boroughs. And what they figured out is it's because of more people living in each household. The prices, the cost of living and the prices for rent and for purchasing a home in New York, of course, are astronomical. It's one of the most expensive cities in the world. So people with less economic means naturally tend to congregate. They'll get a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment and there may be 5 to 10 people living there. They come in contact with other people and the spread is more within the apartment than within the crowded public areas of the city. In the meantime, some of the financiers and the people who are more well off, the elite of the city, so to speak, have already retreated. They've gotten out of the city. They're in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, or somewhere in Colorado in their chalets or whatever. And so they've already escaped that. So I think that was an interesting thing that should be taken into account in public policy, is the fact that families are going to tend to congregate, and it may not depend on urban density as to how much spread you get. So in terms of things like contact tracing and things like that, that's going to come out in the wash, so to speak. So I think it's an interesting point, and it's a very valid thing that you brought up on that.
So Miranda, a question for you there. Are we going to get to a stage where governments get hooked on tracking us, just obsessed by what they can learn by having these apps telling them about our behavior, maybe for benign reasons, you know, knowing where we shop, knowing where we take our leisure, you know, knowing when we tend to go, or where do people tend to come from to the city for work or for leisure or whatever. Are they just going to get hooked on that? You know, and could you see them starting to use it in situations like the riots going on in the US right now? You know, who's rioting? Who's pitching up for, you know, the evening party? Are government's just going to get obsessed by what the data starts to tell them about the citizenry?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. My bigger concern falls with the tech companies and their potential obsession with this over governments right now. And that's because data is money right now. And so as much data as they can get, they can build off of and use and market and continue to make money based off of their business models. On top of that, though, I have previously written an article about how I think social credit scoring could potentially come to North America. And that's where my argument that fear breeds, you know, the willingness to give up privacy. And looking at the riots right now in the US, maybe not even from a government citizen side, but from a citizen side. Can I trust the person standing next to me? Can I trust, you know, this cop that I'm interacting with? Can the cops trust me? And so I think as people get more fearful with riots, with racial challenges, with kind of the gun crisis down in the US as well, I think that people are going to be more willing to be tracked in the name of stability. How governments will play a role in that, or whether it'll be private organizations, I'm not entirely sure. But I can see a movement towards that space, which it might concern me. I haven't decided yet. I think there's a lot more conversations to have around that space. So,
right, let's see what the results were of the polling. I did show them earlier, but no one had voted, so that was my bad. Here they are. So you've convinced people that we're going to see a lot more citizen surveillance and localization of supply chains.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sounds like I positioned that argument well.
Yeah. Not so much expectation around corporate control over corporates. I think you've also convinced people that we need to fear Big Brother with the data.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, I think it's very interesting. This, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric now about loving essential workers, and in the UK we come out on a Thursday evening and we bang our pots and pans. But there's also a sense that a lot of people are saying, but that's maybe all that will be done for them. That, you know, when this is over, we'll just carry on squeezing resources, privatizing services, and they'll become a forgotten but very stressed workforce until the next pandemic, or until the next big peak in this pandemic, and that they'll be easily forgotten again. And you know, I do wonder where that plays out in this timescale.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, let's end. Actually, I'm going to take one of the questions from the audience now. And this is just to everyone can dive in. For the rest of you, you can vote on other people's questions. If you've got questions, do put them in the Q&A. So we're going to take, the first one we're going to take is from Eric McNaughton. And the question goes, narcissistic leaders are a problem, but the bigger challenge is the populace voting for them. Do we need to focus on how to select wiser leaders instead? Let's start with you on that one, Jerry. Why don't you give us your thoughts? I'm trying to unmute you, but I think you're trying to unmute yourself as well.
There we go. You should have me now. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. We do, of course, ultimately it's up to the people, but I think we need to we do need to focus on getting wiser leaders and focus on what was talked about in one political campaign here as the vision thing. We need leaders who are focused on the future, and we need leaders who can think long term and who have demonstrated that. I have a friend who suggested there be established in the U.S. a Department of the Future, just to look at that. So we do need that, but a lot of it is going to depend on circumstances. We have in the U.S. We have Donald Trump to a certain extent because a lot of people felt left out of globalization. There was massive unemployment in the Rust Belt, and because the factories retreated after NAFTA was signed, the car factories would move to Mexico and they'd move elsewhere around the world, and we had the establishment of the global supply chain. So we have to be visionary about the policies we enact, and the policies to a certain extent are going to determine the reaction. So we have to think long term, we have to think contingency about all the policies and recognize that there are going to be human ramifications. I think one step in the right direction is a term that was bandied about earlier, that whole idea of compassionate capitalism. I think it depends to a certain extent not only on government and government policies, but on corporations and corporate policies. We're all stakeholders in this multidimensional world. We're all stakeholders in it. And we all have to recognize, I took a master's program in public diplomacy, and one of the things that kept being hammered home is that we're all stakeholders, we're all actors in this society. There are non-state actors, there are state actors, and they're becoming equally important. And we all have to recognize the ramifications of our actions in terms of the leadership we're going to get. So it's cause and effect, and it goes kind of both ways, but it's an excellent question.
As I say, in the interest of time, I'm going to move to take on one of the other contributors' thoughts on this. So Bruce, let's give you a slightly different version of this question. I'm trying to unmute you. No, there you go. You're good. Yeah. Let's give you a slightly different version of the question. So Jerry's made a quite passionate argument for having wiser leaders, more well-informed leaders. How do we go? I mean, you're an educator. How do we go about developing wiser leaders? How do we manage that process of them having a broader and deeper understanding of the world they're trying to legislate for?
I think certainly that, and we've seen this in the last 20 years, it wasn't around when I was at university and business school a few decades ago, but there's a great deal more emphasis on ethics and integrity inside the university educational system. But that doesn't help us if you've got this fundamental problem where you're developing professional standards that are almost global, but you have very strong views. And I've often come across a situation where people who know the least about something seem to have the strongest views on it, come from the disadvantaged groups. So it's going to be terribly important to be able to involve as many of these people into the educational system. And as a salutary warning, I think that we need to look at what happened in Germany in the 30s, where you had to some extent the same sort of model that might be emerging in other parts of the world today, where the disadvantaged groups that were unemployed thought that, that they'd found a savior. And that can be and is not only extremely dangerous for the people involved in the long term, but it's very dangerous for everybody else. And I think that the whole emphasis on getting people to be more responsible rather than to be power driven. I've always argued that if we could only wave a magic wand and use the word responsibility whenever we start talking about power struggles or the corridors of power, if we started talking about them as the corridors of responsibility, and have you ever heard of a responsibility struggle? But that is really the other side of the coin. And I think that trying to develop a much greater sense of responsibility at all levels of society would help us get more responsible leaders, where the driving force should be integrity and values rather than vision, because the big danger is that a lot of these leaders think that they have the monopoly of the vision, whereas the vision should be coming from a great deal of participation from everybody else.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. Miranda, so you're coming from, you know, you're significantly younger than the rest of us. You're coming from a different generation. Is there a different perspective from your generation or from the generations coming through about how we make governance, those in power, wiser, more responsive, more responsible? Do you see it differently to the rest of us? Do you see different models? Does it all seem like old men playing old men's games? You know, how does this play out for you?
Yeah, that's a big question. Multiple facets to that. One thing that really stuck out with Jerry and Bruce's discussion has been, you know, the cause and effect, and from my experience, the role that social media plays in it. So the filter bubble, which is, you know, if you interact with something on social media and you like it and you comment, you get to see more and more of the same. So for me, that's like crafting videos, but for a neo-Nazi, that's, you know, white supremacy content. And so that gets people more and more stuck in their mindsets and harder to get out of it because they're not being forced to be exposed to other modes of thinking, especially with kind of fake news and some media bias that's getting people into the state of mind where they're voting for these leaders that maybe don't have the best policies. On top of that, the generation that's up and coming now, Gen Z, I think they're about 22, maximum 22 now. They're very much what's called like the truth generation. They dig into and search for what's truth and what's right. There's good things to that, but at the same time, there's also potential that they find that truth in influencers on social media that don't know as much either and are projecting, you know, unresearched values. However, I think it is, you know, a positive signal that people are not necessarily willing to look and settle with what's put right in front of them. So it could be good and bad, but I think going forward, people are wanting the governments to have, especially the younger generation, to have a greater role in creating positive change for the world. And if governments, as our generation's age, are continuing to let us down in that way, I think there will be a lot more tension on current political systems. How that might transition or if it will, I'm not sure, but I think there is a lot of upset and uncertainty that the younger age groups are trying to push to change.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, well, time to move on to our third panelist and their contribution. Let's bring you in now, Jerry, to talk about the themes in your chapter, which are slightly different to what we've been hearing about so far.
Yeah, my chapter is about the health aspects of what's going on, and sort of projecting into the future. Although it comes from the perspective of the year 2035, so it's sort of a hypothetical look back. That's the way it's structured. But it's basically an outline of a scenario that I can see. It's a very optimistic scenario of what might happen as a result of what's going on. And one of the trends I've noticed is that we have an unprecedented period of collaboration and competition going on in the development of a vaccine for the coronavirus. And a lot of people have likened it to the Manhattan Project. I certainly think that's an apt analogy because of the amount of resources that are being launched into it. But I also think back to the International Geophysical Year, which happened in 1957 and 1958. And it was also an unprecedented period of scientific collaboration. It kind of set the standard for scientific collaboration for years to come. And it was a study of what is going on in near Earth orbit and near the Earth at a time of rampant solar activity. And so there was this whole international scientific collaboration to study that. And it led to the launch of the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, and galvanized the space race. I can see sort of a similar thing going on today with the development of a vaccine. We have, on the one hand, there's a lot of collaboration going on. On the other hand, there's fierce competition between the pharmaceutical companies. And it's leading to some very interesting innovations. First of all, as you know, a traditional vaccine is developed by taking a weakened or killed version of a virus, introducing it to the body, and letting the body form its own defenses to it. There's a newer sort of vaccine that's been developed called the RNA vaccine or the mRNA vaccine that takes the ribonucleic acid code for a virus and introduces it to the body. The body actually creates an antigen and then creates the antibody to it. So the advantage of that is it can be digitized. So this RNA vaccine is starting to be more widespread around the world. Now, there are a couple of innovations that have been used in the context of the coronavirus or COVID-19. One is the harvesting of plasma from people who have already recovered from the disease, and you introduce that to select members of the population and let them spread the antibodies through the plasma and just through normal metabolic processes. And then there's the self-spreading vaccine. This is something that's being tested at Johns Hopkins University and elsewhere. And it's just as it sounds. You introduce the vaccine to certain people and then let them spread it socially. So I'm thinking this could result in some ironic developments down the line. In the next pandemic, if self-spreading vaccines take hold, we could see things like social congregation at the beginning of the pandemic. Things like restaurants being open later into the pandemic, or people being invited to movie screenings to socially interact and get these self-spreading vaccines going. Now, at the same time, and Miranda brought this up very brilliantly, we're talking about the concerns about the supply chain. And the supply chain, there are concerns about its vulnerability to geopolitics, about its vulnerability to just logistics. Well, I'm wondering in this scenario for the next 15 years, if the supply chain will be replaced by something I call the innovation chain. The way the innovation chain would work is you take it sort of changes the paradigm. Right now, the paradigm is you produce goods for sale. And the paradigm would change in that under the innovation change, you would license designs for distribution or for purchase. So to give an example, suppose somebody wants to buy a car. You would go to a regional manufacturing hub. These would be smaller than sort of the assembly lines we have in places like Detroit now. And you would go to a regional manufacturing club. You would say, I want a car. And you would license the design for that car, and the car would be 3D printed at the manufacturing hub. And you could, let's say you wanted a hybrid car. You wanted something that looked like a 1969 Dodge Daytona, but was all electric. You could possibly license 2 patents and then get the car customized there. And you would get this sharp-looking car that's also a green car. So just hypothetically. Now, how does that apply to public health? Well, you could take an RNA vaccine, you could code it at a certain point, you could digitize it, and then you could transfer it around the world to these regional manufacturing hubs, which would be, or even to hospitals, anywhere equipped with a 3D printer. And you could take this digital information and then take another device called the digital to biological converter, which is already being experimented with and being used for the development of biologics. And you could use that to synthesize a vaccine. And it would be in real time. You could distribute it all around the world. And this could be a way of dealing with future pandemics. Now, looking even further into the future, you could take a database that would consist of a person's entire digital information on their response, on their immune response to certain diseases. It could be cancer, it could be Alzheimer's disease, it could be one of the hundreds of variations of the common cold. And you could take that, you could digitize that, and that's being experimented with right now by various luminaries in the field. And you could take that and digitize it, and then take the digital to biological converter and create an almost universal vaccine for a lot of different diseases, a sort of cluster vaccine for all of this, that ironically would be universal in the sense that it would cover a number of diseases, but it would also be customized in the sense that it would be tailored to you. So this could lead to a renaissance, or what I call a medical enlightenment. Theoretically, a number of things obviously would have to fall into place, but I think it's highly doable. And one of the things I mentioned in the chapter is that science is the process of finding connections that were previously unknown. Global cooperation is a matter of finding common ground that was previously unexplored. So I think if we focus on this, there could be a silver lining to what's coming out of this coronavirus pandemic, and we could see an optimistic scenario that would be a great leap forward in medicine, theoretically. But if we can envision it, maybe we can do it.
Well, let's get your polling question up and see what the audience think of your question. Okay, I'll do it properly this time so everyone can see it. Yeah, so you've got a multiple choice question here about what are the biggest challenges in dealing with future pandemics. And while we're doing that, let's take some panel reactions. So Miranda, what were your instant reactions to Jerry's idea of moving from supply chains to an innovation chain and rethinking the model of how we do production. It sort of ties in with some of what you were talking about around shortening supply chains as well.
Yeah, I loved that that entire concept. I think as well, I just love the optimism underlying all of it. The one thought I had that I'm quite curious to get Jerry's opinion on is in regards to kind of the incentive underlying pharmaceutical companies. You know, they spend millions, if not billions, to research and develop kind of medical solutions beyond just vaccines, so medicines in general. And so that has been an issue in the past with how do we incentivize these companies to spend that money, but still provide access to the end result to everyone. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts as to how that might change in the future with this.
It's an interesting question because it's actually a current debate. I was reading just today about how the World Health Organization has proposed a patent pool, and the pharmaceutical companies are reacting very strongly to that. They echo the point you made that there are so many, that they've invested so much, so many billions of dollars in taking a risk in something that might not work at all, that to suddenly put that patent into a pool and open source it is not necessarily how do they conduct their risk management then, and how do they potentially stay in business and be more volatile. So it is a challenge for the development of the innovation chain, because the other challenge is the fact that you've got patents coming from many different countries. And you could either have a sort of an umbrella organization like the Intellectual Property Organization under UN auspices or something like that take charge, or you could simply, we could have treaties or whatever, but it is a challenge because anybody who has an innovative idea is going to want to protect that. And I think that's going to get more so in the future, as opposed to sort of the infancy of the internet age when there was a lot of talk about open sourcing. There was a lot of actual work in that. But I think companies, the pharmaceutical companies, are going to be very protective of that. And it's certainly a concern going forward in developing that kind of chain. Although I do see the value of the chain in again being in real time for things like global emergencies and pandemic. And
let's
also
bring Bruce in now, Jerry. Let's bring Bruce in on this and get Bruce's take, just in the interest of time. Bruce, what was your take?
Right, well, there's a lot of very interesting issues that we could talk about, but just two briefly. One is, I think that there's a model, perhaps with the development of the AIDS vaccines, and not exactly cures, but I know that they've done deals with a lot of African countries, which provide them with the medical facilities and products at lower prices. And the issue around that is it's not that the pharmaceutical companies shouldn't get a return, but there shouldn't be excessive profits associated with it. I think that a lot of these areas would benefit from more social enterprise cooperation. And I'm sure that the researchers themselves are not really driven by profit. They might be driven by their Nobel Prizes, but they themselves are driven by wanting to see something that's a real benefit to society. And the other point that I would be interested in your view on, if you're taking this long-term view, is I think, and I think Rohit's come across this a bit, is this whole possibility of controlling the aging process, which is by the time we get to 2035 or 2040, and that's going to be a big game changer in a lot of areas. if that begins to happen?
Jerry, let's take a quick response from you on that one, and then we'll take your polling question. See the results.
Yeah, just very, very quickly. First of all, yes, aging is going to be one area that could be definitely impacted by all of this, because if you create these databases individually, I think through those databases, we're going to rapidly gain an understanding of aging. And then we have to deal with the ramifications of it. If people are living longer, how do we deal with longer living populations? So it's a huge area, and we can only scratch the surface.
Okay, let's get your polling results up and see what your take is on the answers. So we're evenly split. We think it's going to be uneven, and we think there's going to be big inequalities, much lower support for competition for access to breakthrough vaccines, and much lower expectation of public resistance to doing this all again next time round. I wonder if that will vary by country. I wonder whether some countries will have real fatigue. You know, you can imagine that whatever happens in the US, it might be very hard to try and push through second lockdowns or lockdowns for the next pandemic, because they'll say, well, we toughed it out on this one. It was an acceptable cost. Better to just keep the economy going. What's your take, Jerry?
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, we're seeing that sort of fractious response already, and it's going to take determined leadership, and maybe it'll be what we learn from this pandemic. Perhaps all the information hasn't come out in the wash yet, and maybe once we learn more about how this pandemic actually spread, that people will be more accepting. But the U.S. has always been a fractious, kind of a fractious nation with a lot of individualism. So that's going to be, I think that's a valid concern.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the fourth presentation, which is mine. Not really a presentation. I'm just going to share a few ideas. So Steve Wells, Alexander Whittington, and myself wrote a chapter called Navigating a New Landscape. And we explored 8 big shifts that we thought were going to be quite fundamental for all of society as we move through and beyond the pandemic. And we didn't necessarily see them all as playing out, but they were areas in which shifts were possible. I'm going to pick 3 just to talk to you about briefly now. The first is this idea of the tension between, do we restore the old order, or is it time for a big system reboot? On the one hand, you've got a lot of progressives and people trying to take the opportunity to say, no, this is the time for us to be rethinking our governance systems, our economic models, our financial control mechanisms, and the instruments of civil society. This is a perfect opportunity to think about what we need next, because there's no going back. On the other hand, there's a growing voice amongst particularly those in power or responsibility, as Bruce suggests, who are saying, look, we're already frazzled by the process of getting through the pandemic and trying to deal with this. To try and layer on the management and delivery of new systems would just be too much. We need time to consolidate. We need time to work out the true scale of the damage to society. We need to work out the true costs and how we're going to pay for all that. And we need breathing space before we try and implement lots of new systems, particularly on government institutions that are already worn out, just trying to make it through the pandemic. But the voice is coming back, and the voice is coming back quite strongly. And for a lot of people in government as well, starting to say, no, actually, this is a good opportunity. And businesses, as Bruce suggested, starting to say there is a different way of doing this, whether it's Green New Deal, whether it's new relationships with citizens and their engagement in the decision-making processes, whether it's taxation systems, whether it's transparency, whether it's around how we do job creation, how we invest in reskilling, how we rethink the education system, how we manage our relationship with the planet, and how we build new community institutions, some of which started to happen during this pandemic. How do we build those so that society can look after itself more? And now is the time to be experimenting, trying those projects, because society is all too well aware of where things have worked well in getting through the pandemic and where they've really fallen over. And it varies country by country. So, you know, this morning I was hearing a report about Taiwan and how Taiwan had kicked its defense mechanisms in literally before the end of December. As soon as it heard warnings from China about the whistleblower doctor, they weren't going to take any risks, and it put in place a whole bunch of mechanisms. So come early January, they were doing everything that other people are still struggling to implement. And so there's that view that actually maybe we need to do that now. And the question is, really, there's a debate now about, you know, can we afford not to reinvent these things? Can we afford not to put the spotlight on all these mechanisms? Because if we want a fairer, more stable, more inclusive, greener, and long-term focused society, then what seems clear is that a lot of these institutions in society were already failing or already struggling to keep pace with the digital age. And so maybe it's time for a rethink. The second one I want to pick on is this kind of newfound love of facts that society's developed. And Miranda again touched on it. You've got Gen Z coming through, really obsessed with truth and facts, even if it comes from people that you might not associate with the truth. But I think in many countries now, we've gone up a learning curve very quickly about R numbers, about exponential growth, about science. And we're pushing back. We're saying to governments, don't just tell us that the science tells you an answer. Explain that science to us. Tell us what that means. Explain your models by which you're saying, you know, this is how much we'll pay for furlough payments, or this is how much support we'll put into the financial markets versus into the physical economy. We want to know. And arguments like, well, it's too complicated, just don't wash, because those suggest that there's a failure in the education system. And actually, a lot of people are arguing, and we would argue, that it's better to put the information out there now and help people understand it than to hold it back from them and say, no, we know best as political leaders. And it's a push towards transparency, I think. And then the third one that I want to touch on very briefly is one sector of society that we think we're going to need to make decisions about, because it sits at the heart of pretty much everyone's globalization agenda, and that's air transport. On the one hand, it's become a kind of pariah industry because of the environmental footprint. You know, flight shaming was already becoming massive before the industry was hit by the pandemic. Over 80% of flights pretty much everywhere in the world have been grounded. They're starting to take off again. Lots of complexity about how the industry restarts. But there's a more fundamental question, which says, do we want this industry? Because at the moment, about 40% of global trade is delivered by air transport. And do we want to really tie recovery deals to the industry to a massive greening, to moving to new fuels, to moving to alternative flight technologies and all the rest of it? Do we really want to drive that as part of a recovery deal? Or do we want to start to manage down the industry literally and say, no, until you come back with greener options, we're going to try alternative routes. We're going to localize supply chains. We'll do more international trade by video, but we'll very deliberately put a massive cap on the scale of that industry in order to get it greener and then allow it to play a bigger role going forward. So I think decisions need to be made about the priority placed on the industry, because you can't, on the one hand, beat it for its environmental performance, but then say it's at the heart of the global agenda. And you know, in the UK, we talk about global Britain post-Brexit. That doesn't really happen by ship. You know, if Britain wants to do trade with the major trading nations of the world, the Koreas, the Chinas, the Indias, whatever, you're not going to do all of that by video. You have to travel. So we know the industry is important. We just have to decide how important, and then what is a coherent strategy for how you help the industry navigate through this crisis and come out greener, and stronger and more efficient, because it's also an industry where people say, you know, the best way to make $1 million in the airline industry is to start with $1 billion. You know, most people lose money when they start airlines. The airlines make a tiny profit on every seat, less than $5 on average. So we're asking a lot of them. But if we think they're central to the agenda, if we believe that they're part of the global economy and a globalized economy, then we need to have a much bigger, almost, you know, Marshall Plan for the industry to say, how does it get greener? How does it become more efficient? And how does it play the role we want it to play? Or think very differently about the future of the industry in a changing world. So those are 3 of the 8 ideas that we touched on. I won't go through the rest because I want to bring the panel in for the chat. But I'm going to start with a polling question again. So I had a polling question, which was, there you go. Let's get this one up on screen. So if we imagine we're 3 years out from the present day, we're looking back to 2020, how much might have changed and what might be different about the new order by then? And while we're doing that, let's take responses to what I had to say from, we'll start with you, Miranda, this time. Your response to the 3 issues we talked about total system reboot versus stay the same, the pursuit of truth now as a kind of core in society, and the pursuit of facts, and then making some sort of decisions about what we want from air transport.
Yeah, the 2 things really stuck out to me. One was the air transport, and I previously read, this was probably 1.5 years ago, the opinion that in the future, vacationing through air transport will be a privilege of the wealthy because it will be so heavily taxed, and we'll have the technology where for work you don't need to travel. When I first read that, my thought was that's going to come a lot later in my lifetime. So, you know, got 10 years at least to travel as much as I want. But now kind of that perspective that you're bringing in, that maybe this could actually be the start of that. Like, we've seen what it takes to potentially solve the climate crisis. And although it's not feasible to go to this extreme all times, it could be the start of the taxation and reinvigoration of that field. And then the second thought, I'll make it quick, on this as well as kind of the total system reboot. One of my favorite quotes is that in regards to futures thinking, it was from Wendell Bell, that he chose to be optimistic because, you know, optimistic still meant that we had an ability to change the future, and pessimistic just means that your hands are tied. And so I think that's also what Jerry is, what I really liked about it, is it's a more optimistic thought that this could be the start of something new and something really good. So I liked that as well.
Great. Bruce.
Right, I think that one of the things that comes out of what you've been talking about and what we've been talking about already is this need to give the climate change issue probably a great deal more thought. By all accounts, an awful lot of people have their lifespan severely shortened because of atmospheric pollution. And one of the issues that has happened is that we haven't actually started measuring this decades ago, and we're now surprised that it seems to be quite widespread. We've got to try to work out how we can keep track of some of these environmental issues that are socially damaging, because that's the only way they're going to get addressed. On the air transport issue, that's a very, very difficult one. I think that domestically, in lots of countries, we could see the reinvigoration of rail travel. And as I was arguing, I think we should try to emphasize the quality of the travel experience rather than the speed of the trains. But probably 150 miles an hour is quite satisfactory, although there seems to be global competition ego-driven to get them up to 350 miles an hour, which seems to me to be involve an unjustified amount of additional cost. But a lot of the air traffic in the UK and in Europe could probably be quite effectively replaced by rail traffic.
Jerry.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to points 2 and 3. As far as the second point, this whole hunger for facts, and I think Miranda was the one who touched on it earlier about Gen Z too. A lot of it stems from the fact that there are no more gatekeepers. Here in the US, we had, when I grew up, we had 3 evening news programs, and they along with the major newspapers controlled the news agenda, and they were sort of the litmus test for truth. And of course now we have a much more fragmented age, and I wonder if we'll develop gatekeepers or if we'll become more effective editors on our own. And I think that's one of the major points there. As far as air transportation, I think part of that is going to depend on the type of economy we develop. There's been a lot of talk about the gig economy. And if that comes true, we have companies like Geophysical that are sending people around the world for short-term stints, like 3 months in Singapore, 3 months in Taipei or whatever. And if we move to that model, air transportation is going to become more important, or more, there are going to be more passengers and everything. If we get more localized, maybe less so. So I think part of it's going to hinge on the type of economy we develop going forward.
I think that on the air transport one, there's a risk that we have a very mixed picture across the globe. So in Europe, you know, we'll be very confused. We'll be wanting environmental protection. We'll be putting more pressures on the airlines, and they're already shrinking. You know, that could just continue their shrinkage. Whereas in Asia, you're seeing, you know, a view that they want to grow air travel, increase connectivity between the major Asian hubs, and a feeling that a lot of them are safer anyway from a kind of pandemic perspective. And then the US just feeling like it just has to get back to where it was, because it couldn't possibly scale back. So yeah, I think you could end up with quite a confused picture on the different continents. And then Africa with just so much to develop yet. You know, it's hard to imagine Africa having a smaller air transport footprint in 5 years' time than it did in 2019. So you could see a very uneven picture of development. Let's share the polling results. This is interesting. This is the one with probably the closest spread of any of the questions we've asked so far. So it looks like we believe that our governments are going to, the majority just ever so slightly believe that our governments are going to get better at managing crisis. And I think some have done very, very well. Others, you know, are getting a pretty poor score. And then there's a tie between the total systems reboot and a more CSR focused business community. And then slightly lower levels of support for restoration of the old order, focus on truth and facts. We're really not optimistic about getting our act together globally and having an inclusive response. And that's the one that worries me, that I think if we don't do something for the planet, you know, we really are holding the whole planet back. If we don't try and create new versions of the Marshall Plan and solutions that put proper civil infrastructure into, you know, a lot of countries that are on the brink or, you know, falling over. Okay, let's take, sorry, did you have a point to make there, Bruce? You raising your hand?
Yeah, if I can,
yeah,
just a quick point there. I was amazed fairly recently, having been lucky enough to go to India, how obsessive they were in almost the whole of the country on reducing the use of plastics. And it's amazing how quickly, partly as a result of that David Attenborough program, they've, round the world, people have taken all that on board. But this whole issue is rather paradoxical, as almost all the PPE equipment that all the health workers are wanting and using are based on plastic. So we're getting the solutions to some of the problems pushed into other areas. But I think one of the other big areas of cooperation seems to be to try to clean up the oceans. And the pollution of the oceans is a major, major issue that needs to be given much more serious attention.
I agree. Okay, let's take some time to answer some of the questions that have come in from the participants. And the first one we're going to take is from Dr. Rosanna Huck. And she says, employees are asked to be innovative, creative, and they are being burdened by responsibilities by working from home, dealing with the family, homeschooling, etc. Is it time that leaders in organizations started thinking about empowering employees? Can empowering employees also help to develop trust? Who wants to lead up on that one? Do we need to, as part of the New Deal, a reboot, is empowerment central to the new solution? And how do we go about doing that in a way that employees trust that they're being empowered and not spotlighted in case things go wrong? Miranda, let's take your views on empowerment.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that empowerment would be at the core of it, but I think a lot of companies are moving from the mindset of profitability first to the triple bottom line. And part of that is taking care of and empowering your employees. We are seeing those moves to working from home indefinitely, which could potentially be a really good thing for certain people. However, there's also a potential that the repercussions of this is that now if you're working from home in San Francisco, then we might as well hire somebody that is cheaper in a different country. So there could be a major globalization of hiring and employment that could dramatically affect people here as well. In regards to as well kind of empowerment in our current situation, it definitely is should be kind of propagated from the top down, that we know that we're still in a crisis. We don't expect you to be optimized performers right now. So yeah, those are kind of my top level thoughts, but I'd be interested with the other panelists.
Jerry, Bruce, do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, just a couple. One is that in a lot of cases, empowerment means giving people more responsibility. But unless you match that up with more authority, it can easily become very stressful. And one of the things that is happening with home working, and one of the reasons why it was resisted for many decades, is that when you went into an office, what was managed was your time and not your job. And if you can define your job pretty well effectively, then that increases in flexibility quite considerably. And the whole management process can be much more engaging all round. It's going to be interesting to see how far that this process ends up by delayering organizations, or whether, and you're not going to be able to move everybody into home working. It's particularly relevant for a certain group of knowledge workers if they've got the facilities, but you still need meeting places and meeting opportunities. Not all of them by Zoom. You need some of them actually in a coffee bar or a hotel, but you don't necessarily need an office for it.
Yeah, Jerry.
Yeah, I think one part of the answer to the question hinges on how the organization is structured going forward. If companies start moving toward a model where a lot of their employees are actually independent contractors, they're going to have a lot more freedom and authority in doing that. On the other hand, it's a double-edged sword because you have to ask what's the motivation for those companies to regard them as independent contractors. Part of it may be just to save on health insurance and things like that. You see the things that are going on with the Uber and Lyft and how the drivers are regarded. Here in Los Angeles, we have, or in California, we have rules that govern that, and they cannot be regarded as independent contractors. So I think part of it is going to hinge on the structure. I think we are moving into an era of personal branding, and when people are going to be more on their own. So I think the ideal scenario is if companies continue to, if we move into an era where of like compassionate capitalism, where companies are compensating their employees well, and at the same time giving them more authority, I think that would be a good trend.
I think there's a split going on right now between the companies who are discovering that actually by letting their employees loose, letting them work from home, do their job, and not, monitoring them as much, they're getting on, they're making decisions, they're resolving issues on the fly, they're learning how to be empowered, the company's learning how to acknowledge that mistakes might be made and support them so that they have good information to make good decisions. And so there's one group of people who are already doing that. I think there's another group who are horrified at the fact that they just can't see their employees. And that's evidenced by, again, there's a massive rise in the US at the moment of companies buying and installing surveillance software to monitor what their employees are doing, down to keystrokes and the amount of time they're spending looking at the screen and things. And legally, both in the US and Europe, you don't have to tell your employees you're doing it. But the pandemic has seen a massive spike in the take-up of such software, which I think is very intrusive and kind of works against people feeling empowered, because more and more you could say, well, if you're monitoring everything I do, I'm not going to do anything out of the norm. I'm only going to do what you tell me to do, and I'm going to make it someone else's responsibility if I fail. So I think it's going to go two ways in that one. The other thing I think is interesting is how a lot of people are actually already recoiling against the idea of working from home. A friend of mine works for Bangalore Airport, and he said the people who've been furloughed are just pitching up to work now because they're fed up of talking to each other on screens. And actually they just want to be in a socially distanced workplace environment so they can have a normal conversation without having to do it through the screen, because they're saying it's frying their brains to be on these things. Actually, for some people, they feel like it's limiting their creativity, not enhancing it, because everything is done through this one medium. Two more questions we're going to take. I think we've got time for two more. So let's take a related one first, and then David's got a good one to take us out on. Eric McNaughton again. Thank you, Eric, for all your questions. If lower income employees are more at risk between the nature of their work and that they may have more exposure in households with more people, how likely is it that employers will move to automate those jobs to avoid disruption due to illness? Right? Will robotic process automation take over? Will we discover that it's better to have a fully automated workforce and therefore they're not impacted by the pandemic? Who wants to go first on that one? Is the pandemic a precursor to more job automation? Bruce, you look like you're...
Well, the only thing I would say to those of you that can remember, and there are one or two around here, I remember going round a car factory in the 60s and seeing one in the 21st century, and they're totally different. They're totally automated. In the old days, you used to have hundreds and hundreds of people on the production line. The same applies to lots of other areas. And of course, the resistance to that sort of development ended up by almost putting our steel industry and our coal industry and our shipbuilding industry out of business, because we ended up by subsidizing the old way of doing things as if it was a social service rather than helping people get new jobs.
Jerry, any thoughts on, is the pandemic a precursor to job automation?
I think the automation process is going to continue independent of the pandemic as well. But I think one, it's something I touched on in my chapter. I think the trend is going to be towards smaller scale fabrication, and there will still be jobs for people who customize. So it's going to be a higher skill type thing. And I think companies will move away from the model of having a number of people in a plant. There'll be more plants, but fewer people at the plants and more opportunity for social distancing. So I think it'll be a mix, but definitely more automation is on the way. It's even on the way in my field, in writing. The AI is being used to write simple business stories. So I think that trend's going to continue, and it's going to be spurred on by the pandemic or the threat of a pandemic, but it's also going to continue even without that.
Miranda.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like right now for companies, it's especially with them, it's a no-win situation. Like we in our community had a meat packing plant outbreak, and they're an essential supply chain trying to meet the hoarding demands of our communities to have this meat. But at the same time, they didn't take the right precautions, and they're being extensively blamed and shamed for the outbreak at the plant based on corporate ethics. And so looking at that situation from their perspective, it's a lot easier in the long run to have that not be an issue at all. Instead, just automate, and then it takes away the need for that. So I definitely agree, and I think that this will continue to evolve that.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a couple of different levels of this. One is you're already seeing it, the use of things like robotic process automation, where they're just saying that let's look at all the tasks that humans do, where they're moving data from one system to another, and let's automate that part of it using RPA or hyper automation. And then can we automate the decision-making parts of their role as well, and gradually take them away? And can we redesign work to automate it so we just have less people involved? And you see that going on in a lot of places. The second is, I think, a lot of businesses discovering that actually they can do a lot more with technology than they thought was possible because they were forced into it. So restaurants that have introduced automated ordering systems because they've introduced takeaway for the first time. And suddenly they've discovered that an awful lot of the work that was done by the waiting staff can now be done by the tech. And in the kitchen, you know, more and more automation to reduce the number of people and then the risk of staff being off ill. And I think a lot of businesses are discovering relatively cheap automation solutions. You know, someone just before this call was on pitching me on a Sunday evening, you know, for their robotic solution that's $1,200, and you can design it to do whatever you want. It's like Lego, you know, you just decide what you want it to be and their robot will do it. And that was, by the way, I'm not pitching for them, I'm just explaining their thing. But, you know, when that sort of stuff comes through and we realize that for $1,200 and maybe $1,000 of training, we can set up a robot to do an awful lot of the work that a $20,000 a year member of staff might have done, you know, as a cook or a cleaner, or, you know, I think a lot of jobs will get automated that we kind of thought were 4 or 5 years away before they were. I think this has accelerated, you know, lots of levels of automation. And I think that, you know, the talk of, yes, there'll be, you know, a big decline in employment once people come off furlough schemes, but then the economy will bounce back and all the jobs will come back with it. The economy may well come back. I mean, it will eventually, but I don't think the take up of jobs will be anywhere near as fast. I think people will lag their their recruitment of new employees and look to technology more and more and only go for employees where they have to, the caveat being the tech-heavy sectors that just need more and more tech people. So let's make this our final question from David Wood, another contributor to the book. Hi, David. His question goes back to the conversation we were having with Miranda. And his question is, would higher levels of citizen surveillance by various parts of the state really be such a bad thing? If the wider democratic institutions in society were strong enough to ensure that any politicians who misuse such data lost their positions? Sorry, wrong emphasis. So would it work if the institutions were strong enough? In other words, could a capable big society keep in check any big brother tendencies of government? I'm going to take all the panel, but I'm going to bring David in to answer his own question when he's heard everyone else. So I will, while you're speaking, let's start with you, Miranda. It was your question, so your topic.
Yeah,
so David,
for sure.
I'm assuming you're okay being promoted to panelist, are you?
Yeah, it's definitely a very heavy question with lots to look at. And, you know, if you look at kind of the origin and the root of this big brother surveillance and things, as I said, it's trust and security and safety. And we've had that in regards to financial services for years with just the financial credit score. And I think there is potential for this to be, that concept to be extremely powerful, to be able to go to a large gathering and know that everybody in attendance is 4 out of 5 rating and has, you know, if they own a gun, it's been 5 years and they've dealt with it quite well. On the flip side of that, though, there's a couple things that we would need to sort out in this process. And one is who owns the system underlying this rating? Is it private companies? Is it the government? And then what liberties do the people who are running and building the system have within it? On top of that, my second big concern is what attributes of society will you lose out on, or could you lose out on in this system if you have a low enough rating? Are they going to be as fundamental as your access to healthcare or your access to food? Likely not, but what other things could you lose out on that could seriously detriment your quality of life? And do we trust that, you know, rating each other, whether you're a government person or a regular citizen, that that's a sure enough way to be confident that you should lose out on that liberty or that access? So lots of things to explore.
Jerry, should we trust that big society and our institutions could control big government's use of big data?
I'm kind of pessimistic about that. I've always thought that the more pervasive that surveillance gets, the more of a chilling effect it's going to have on our behavior, whether or not those institutions are in place to provide checks and balances to that. I think there's just, if you know that all your actions are being watched, and there's sort of a generalized feeling, metaphorically at least, that somebody is peering over your shoulder, I think that trumps the democratic institutions. It just, you have a situation where ostensibly you have rights on paper, but somebody's following you all the time. It's sort of like freedom of the press. I may have the freedom to publish whatever I want, but there are certain things that may produce a chilling effect. And while I still have the right, I may think twice before doing it. So I probably take a pessimistic view of this and think we need to use those institutions to limit the overseers, so to speak, right from the start, and then move from there rather than implementing it and trusting our democratic institutions to provide the checks and balances.
Bruce.
Well, I think the first thing that we need to ensure is that we get as much transparency as possible. And I think the second thing is that if we're getting this sort of system or operated in, sorry, inside any organizational structure, then it also ought to apply to the people at the top. And it shouldn't be used as a mechanism for the people at the top to think that they're controlling other people. As a tangent, really, but quite a relevant one, we in London have an awful lot of CCTV, which is now moving into the whole area of facial recognition. That's been incredibly valuable in tracking terrorist activity and all sorts of other issues. And by and large, I think people have accepted it. And it's a bit paradoxical that if everybody's now got to go around wearing a mask just when we've got perfected facial recognition technology, but I think we'll sort that out in a year or two's time.
Interesting. I think it all depends on where you are in the world and how data has been used by governments. Again, the thing I was listening to this morning about Taiwan was incredible in terms of how strong their civil society institutions have become, and how after they had their kind of protests a couple of years ago, they've got a much more open and transparent government. They have much stronger checks and balances, so they were able to implement their track and trace, their monitoring solutions very effectively. And there are very strong citizen controls on government to push back if they think they're abusing the system. If I contrast that by what I'm reading about the way in which the UK's track and trace system is being built, the way it's being staffed, the way people are basically, the track and tracers, the contact tracers, are largely spending their days watching box sets on Netflix or playing video games and not being trained. And there's a horrendous article about, from a whistleblower in The Guardian about this. Now, okay, that's only one person's experience, but you're hearing lots of examples. That doesn't give me confidence that A, we can deliver these solutions, and B, the mechanisms of government, governance, and civil society are strong enough to put these things in place and ensure they're used well on, in service of the citizen. David, we're going to give you the last word. I tried to activate your video, but it looks like you're just on audio. So do you want to share with us?
Yes, that was a great discussion. I have changed my mind about this over the last few months, and my instincts were to be afraid of governments that have too much information about us. I was afraid if the police know too much about us and so on. But I have seen, as Bruce mentioned, the benefits of at least some parts of the state being able to observe us. If we traveling too fast in our cars, it's good that the police can observe that and intervene. If there are people who look like they're about to commit a terrorist atrocity, again, it's good. But that effectiveness does need to be kept in check. And I think we need to look at examples around the world where this keeping in check is taking place. Taiwan is a great example. There is also South Korea, whose tracking and tracing has been widely looked at and said, wow, they've been very good at finding out what's going on, knowing where people who are infected are going. The point I would make is that South Korea also has a strong track record of keeping track of what their presidents do. In fact, at least half of their presidents have ended up in prison not too long after they left because the democratic institutions are quite strong there. The richest man in South Korea, one of the richest men in South Korea, the head of Samsung, was also in prison for a while. So that's a way of a demonstration that some societies can have strong institutions. It involves a free press that's not dominated by a few rich oligarchs. It involves lawyers, it involves the civil service, it involves the checks and balances. So that's the vision where I would like to go to. And of course, we are far away from that, sadly, in some parts of Britain. But I don't think it's a completely lost cause. And I think there are remnants of that big society, which I would like to strengthen. So my vision for the future is that sometimes we do need a strong state, but that strong state is okay so long as there's a strong network of checks and balances. It doesn't all need to be out in the open. There are certain things that should not be published openly, but there should be trusted members of society who are keeping an eye on the overseers. So there's a network of watchers of watchers of watchers. And if we get it right, it allows us to have much more confidence in the way society functions overall.
Thank you. Great note to take us out on. So thank you firstly to the panelists for sharing your ideas so freely and for engaging in such a wide-ranging debate with questions that were so far off your topics they could have been completely a totally different chapter you could have written about them. But and secondly, thank you to everyone who's taken part and asked questions. It's been great. And just a reminder that tomorrow we have the all-day summit from 10 a.m. UK time. That's BST, not GMT, running till 10 p.m. UK time. So hopefully we pick up most time zones in the planet for somebody to be able to come in. There'll be 22 of the contributors sharing their ideas, and we'll be discussing the ideas in from the other 3 contributors who just can't be there to take part. 10-minute sessions for each person to talk about their ideas. And then after each group of panelists, we'll have a discussion with them, be a little break on a fairly regular basis. So if you are up for the entire marathon, you will have time to go to the bathroom, make tea, have lunch, or you can just drop in and out, and it's all free. And then of course, buy the book, and it's still available at that 30% discount. I'm sure you've all had like a million emails from me about it. So it's available at a 30% discount until midnight tonight. I think let's say 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, UK time, and then it goes on normal sale everywhere. So thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you can make it tomorrow and to the future versions of this session that we'll be holding every Sunday evening for a couple of months, so that each of the panel members can come in and talk a little more, and then talk more widely about those ideas and issues and possibilities shaping our future. So thank you very much for coming, and have a great evening wherever you are in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.